A woman lies in a hospital bed the night before surgery, and every doctor in the building has told her the same thing. The odds aren't great. She doesn't spend that night arguing with the doctors. She spends it repeating one sentence to herself, silently, over and over until she falls asleep. Not a prayer exactly. Not a wish exactly. Something closer to an instruction, given directly to a part of her mind she'd never consciously addressed before in her life. She wakes up the next morning and the surgeon, mid-operation, finds something considerably less severe than the scans had predicted. Coincidence, maybe. But Harry Carpenter, a retired aerospace materials engineer who spent 40 years studying exactly this kind of story, doesn't think so. And in The Genie Within, he lays out a specific, almost mechanical explanation for why deliberately talking to a part of your own mind you've never learned to address might be doing far more work than you've ever given it credit for. Here's the question worth sitting with before we go further. If 90% of your own mind is running the show without you ever consulting it directly, what happens the day you finally learn its language? Stay with me. This one gets stranger and more useful the further in you go. Asterisk asterisk, a simple truth to start asterisk asterisk. Here's the plain truth Carpenter opens with, borrowed from decades of research in hypnotherapy and cognitive science. Your conscious mind, the part doing the thinking right now as you listen to this, makes up only a small fraction of your total mental activity. The vast majority of what actually drives your behavior, your habits, your reflexive reactions, even a measurable portion of your physical health, runs on a separate system entirely, one operating well below the level of conscious awareness. Carpenter calls this system the genie, and the metaphor is more precise than it first sounds. A genie in the old stories doesn't evaluate whether a wish is wise. It doesn't argue, doesn't editorialize, doesn't protect you from your own bad ideas. It simply executes exactly what it's told, literally, faithfully, without judgment. Carpenter's argument is that your subconscious mind behaves almost identically. It doesn't distinguish between a goal you consciously chose and a belief you absorbed by accident at age 7. It just keeps executing whatever instruction is currently loaded, whether or not you ever consciously approved it. The psychologist Carl Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carpenter's entire book is, in effect, a practical manual for doing exactly what Jung described, not through years of analysis, but through specific, repeatable techniques for talking directly to the part of the mind that had been running things unsupervised the whole time. Asterisk asterisk, why the genie grants wishes. You never meant to make asterisk asterisk. Here's where the metaphor turns from charming to genuinely useful. Because Carpenter's central warning isn't that the subconscious is unreliable. It's that the subconscious is disturbingly reliable, executing whatever instruction it's given with total fidelity, including instructions you never meant to give it in the first place. Say a sentence like, "I always mess up presentations often enough," even as a joke, even under your breath after a bad one. And Carpenter's argument is that the genie doesn't hear the joke. It hears the instruction, files it, and starts quietly working to make it true, the same tremor in your hands, the same blanking mid-sentence, showing up right on schedule the next time you stand in front of a room. Not because you're cursed, because you handed your own genie a clear, repeated command, and it did precisely what genies do. This reframes a familiar piece of advice: watch your self-talk, in a much sharper way than the version most people have heard. It isn't about vague positivity for its own sake. It's about recognizing that every repeated sentence you say to yourself, out loud or silently, functions as a literal instruction to a system that cannot tell the difference between your considered goals and your careless complaints. Asterisk asterisk, the laws the genie obeys. Asterisk asterisk, Carpenter doesn't leave this at the level of a nice metaphor. He lays out specific principles he argues the subconscious reliably follows, patterns he distilled from decades of studying hypnotherapy, psychology, and his own teaching practice, which are worth understanding individually because Each one changes how you'd actually use this system. The first is that the subconscious accepts repetition as truth, regardless of whether the repeated statement is actually accurate. Say something enough times, with enough emotional charge behind it, and the genie eventually treats it as settled fact. The way a rumor repeated often enough starts to feel true even to the people who started it. The second is that the subconscious responds far more powerfully to imagery and emotion than to logical argument. You can explain to yourself, rationally for hours, why a fear is irrational, and the fear often doesn't budge, because logic is the conscious mind's native language, not the subconscious mind's. Vivid mental imagery, paired with real emotion, speaks the genie's actual dialect in a way a spreadsheet of reasons never will. The third, and this is the one Carpenter spends the most time on, is that the subconscious cannot process a negative directly. Tell yourself don't think about failing, and the mind, unable to picture an absence, ends up picturing failing anyway, just with a faint, largely ineffective don't tacked onto the front of it. This is why Carpenter insists so strongly on stating goals in the positive. Not, I won't be nervous, but I will be calm. The genie can only build toward an image you actually hand it. *** talking to your genie. 4 ways in ***. The practical core of the book concerns actually establishing communication with this system, something Carpenter argues most people never deliberately attempt in their entire lives, despite it running roughly 90% of their mental operations. He outlines several specific channels. Affirmation, stated repeatedly in the present tense, as though already true, works because the genie treats confident repetition as instruction rather than aspiration. Visualization, holding a specific, sensory-rich mental image of an already achieved goal, works because imagery is the genie's native language in a way that spoken words alone aren't. A relaxed, borderline drowsy state, the specific window just before sleep or just after waking, works because the analytical, skeptical conscious mind, the part that normally argues with every affirmation you attempt, is naturally quieter in that window, leaving a more direct channel open to the system underneath it. There's a well-documented account of the golfer Jack Nicklaus, who described never hitting a shot, even in practice, without first running a vivid, detailed mental film of the ball's entire flight and landing before ever swinging the club. He credited that specific rehearsal, not just physical practice, as central to his consistency at the highest level of the sport. Whether or not Nicklaus had ever read a word about subconscious programming, Carpenter would argue he'd independently discovered exactly the mechanism the book describes. Repeated, vivid, emotionally engaged imagery, delivered directly and consistently, doing work that willpower alone never could. The double-minded trap ***, one of Carpenter's more genuinely useful concepts, addresses a frustration nearly everyone has experienced without having a name for it. Setting a goal with total sincerity, working toward it consistently, and still somehow sabotaging it, again and again, in ways that seem to defy explanation. Carpenter calls this being double-minded, a state where the conscious mind has committed to a goal while an older, contradictory subconscious belief, installed years or decades earlier, is quietly working against it. Someone consciously determined to build wealth, while carrying a subconscious belief absorbed in childhood that money is somehow dangerous, or that people who have it are corrupted by it, isn't lacking discipline. They're running 2 competing instructions simultaneously, and Carpenter's argument is that the older, deeper instruction usually wins that contest, however sincere the newer, conscious commitment feels. The philosopher William James, writing decades before modern neuroscience existed, observed that the greatest revolution of his generation was the discovery that human beings, by changing the inner attitudes of their minds, can change the outer aspects of their lives. Carpenter's contribution is a specific diagnostic for exactly when that revolution stalls out, not when someone lacks sincerity, but when an old, unexamined belief is still quietly running in the background, contradicting the new one nobody ever went back to formally overwrite. Resolving the conflict. Finding the root belief Carpenter's practical answer to being double-minded isn't simply trying harder at the new affirmation. It's tracing the contradictory belief back to its origin, because a vague, unnamed old belief is far harder to overwrite than one you've actually identified and can address directly. His method involves a kind of gentle, structured self-questioning. When did I first come to believe this? What situation, what person, what specific moment planted this idea? Often, Carpenter notes, the belief traces back to a single remembered sentence, a parent's offhand comment about money, an early, humiliating public failure that quietly generalized into, "I'm not the kind of person who succeeds at this." Once identified, the old belief can be addressed directly and specifically, rather than simply outshouted by a louder, newer affirmation layered ineffectively on top of it. This is, in effect, an amateur, self-directed version of what a skilled hypnotherapist does professionally, and Carpenter is upfront that his own background, teaching self-hypnosis techniques for decades, shapes this entire approach. The goal isn't to erase the old memory. It's to consciously examine it, recognize it no longer serves any actual purpose, and deliberately install a new, aligned instruction in its place. So both the conscious commitment and the subconscious pattern are finally pointing in the same direction. A full example. Rewriting one specific instruction let's walk through how this would actually work with a concrete example, the way Carpenter's own book likes to illustrate its methods. Picture someone who has tried repeatedly to become more comfortable speaking in meetings, has read the advice, practiced the techniques, and still freezes at the exact moment a hand goes up around the table. Using Carpenter's framework, the first step isn't another round of willpower. It's tracing the pattern backward. Was there an early moment, a classroom humiliation, a harsh correction from an authority figure, where speaking up first got punished rather than rewarded? Once located, that specific memory becomes the actual target, rather than the vague, generalized anxiety sitting on top of it. Next comes the positive, present-tense instruction, stated specifically enough to actually mean something. Not, "I won't be nervous," but "I speak clearly and calmly in meetings." Paired with this, a vivid, repeated visualization, not a fuzzy general image but a specific, sensory scene, the actual conference room, the actual moment of speaking, the felt sense of a steady voice and a calm chest, rehearsed deliberately in that relaxed window just before sleep, when the analytical mind's usual objections are naturally quieter. Carpenter's claim isn't that this produces results in a single session. It's that consistent, repeated instruction, delivered through the genie's actual native channels, imagery, emotion, repetition, gradually overwrites an old pattern the same way the old pattern was originally installed. Not through a single dramatic event, but through repetition, until the new instruction becomes simply what the mind does by default, the way the old fear once did. Why the body listens to one of the more striking claims in the book extends the genie metaphor beyond mood and behavior into physical health. And it's worth examining carefully because it's simultaneously the book's most provocative claim and its most scientifically defensible one. Depending on exactly how it's framed, Carpenter points to the field of psychoneuroimmunology, the study of how mental and emotional states influence immune function, and argues that chronic negative emotion, fear, resentment, grudges held for years, doesn't stay contained in the realm of mood. It measurably suppresses immune response, while sustained positive emotional states are associated with better health outcomes across a range of studies. This part of his argument tracks reasonably well with a real and growing body of mainstream research. The mind-body connection, once dismissed as pseudoscience, is now a recognized, if still developing, field within medicine itself. Where Carpenter's argument becomes considerably more speculative is in extending this general finding toward specific claims about visualization and affirmation, directly treating, or resolving particular illnesses. The honest, well-supported version of this idea is that chronic stress and unresolved negative emotion are genuine risk factors worth taking seriously, and that emotional regulation genuinely supports physical health. The considerably less supported version, which the book sometimes drifts toward in its more inspirational passages, is that sufficiently vivid positive visualization can substitute for medical treatment. The first claim deserves real respect. The second deserves real skepticism. And readers doing the practical exercises in this book are well served by holding on to that distinction even while taking the underlying mind-body connection seriously. Asterisk asterisk, a practical exercise for tonight asterisk asterisk. If you want a concrete way to start applying this before you even finish listening, Carpenter's method offers a simple entry point that requires nothing more than 5 minutes and a bed you were already planning to be in. Tonight, in that specific window after you've turned off the light but before sleep actually arrives, when the analytical, argumentative part of your mind is naturally at its quietest, pick one single sentence, stated positively, present tense, specific enough to mean something. Not "I want to be more confident," but something closer to "I speak up clearly when I have something worth saying." Repeat it slowly, silently, 6 or 7 times, and pair it, if you can, with one vivid, specific mental image of yourself actually doing the thing the sentence describes. Not a vague feeling of confidence, but an actual remembered or imagined room, an actual moment, an actual felt sense of your own steady voice. Carpenter's claim isn't that this produces an overnight transformation. It's that this specific window, repeated consistently over weeks rather than attempted once and abandoned, is where the genie actually listens most closely, precisely because the usual gatekeeper, your skeptical, arguing conscious mind, has finally stepped aside long enough to let the instruction through unchallenged. Asterisk asterisk now. Let's be honest asterisk asterisk, every book like this deserves an honest accounting in return, and here it is. Carpenter's model, built substantially on decades of hypnotherapy practice and personal observation rather than controlled clinical research, sits closer to applied folk psychology than to rigorously tested neuroscience. Concepts like a fixed 90% versus 10% split between conscious and subconscious processing are useful as a teaching metaphor, but shouldn't be mistaken for a precise, measured neurological fact. The actual relationship between conscious and automatic mental processing is considerably messier and less quantifiable than a clean percentage suggests. There's a second limitation worth nomming directly. The book leans on anecdote, a recovery here, a changed habit there as its primary form of evidence. And anecdotes, however compelling individually, don't distinguish between genuine causal mechanism and simple regression to the mean. The ordinary tendency for unusually bad situations to improve somewhat on their own over time, with or without any specific intervention. A reader in real medical distress could reasonably take from the book's more dramatic health claims an implication that visualization and affirmation can substitute for actual medical treatment. A conclusion the book doesn't explicitly make, but doesn't work especially hard to guard against either. A third point concerns the cannot process a negative claim, which is a popular idea in self-help writing, but is more of a useful rule of thumb than an established finding backed by strong experimental consensus. The underlying practical advice, state goals in positive, specific, present tense language, remains genuinely sound regardless, but it's worth holding the stronger neurological framing around it a little more loosely than the book's confident tone suggests. Even with those caveats, the book's practical core holds up reasonably well against what more mainstream psychology does support. Repeated, vivid mental rehearsal measurably improves performance in sports and skill acquisition. Self-talk demonstrably shapes mood and confidence. And identifying the origin of a limiting belief is a genuinely established technique in several schools of therapy. Carpenter's genie metaphor is a simplification, but it's a simplification built around techniques that, in more clinically cautious language, are widely recognized as useful. Asterisk asterisk the takeaway. What to actually carry with you asterisk asterisk, so let's set the metaphor aside and see what's left, in plain terms. First, notice what you're repeating to yourself, including the offhand, half-joking complaints, because a system that treats repetition as instruction doesn't distinguish between the sentences you meant and the ones that just slipped out. Second, state what you actually want, not what you're trying to avoid. I'm not going to fail this, and I'm going to succeed at this. Aim at the same outcome, but only one of them gives your mind an actual image to build toward. Third, when the same self-sabotage shows up again and again, despite genuine, sincere effort, look for the older, contradictory belief underneath it, rather than simply trying harder at the newer one layered on top. Fourth, and this is the one worth sitting with, change here rarely comes from one dramatic insight. It comes the same way the old pattern was built in the first place, through repetition, specific and vivid, applied consistently enough that it eventually becomes the mind's new default, rather than a wish you have to consciously remember to make. You've been talking to your own mind your whole life, mostly by accident, mostly without noticing. Carpenter's real argument isn't that you have a genie waiting to grant your wishes. It's that you've already been making wishes this entire time. In every offhand sentence and every half-formed fear you've repeated without thinking. The only real question left is whether you're finally ready to choose them on purpose.